Well, hello and welcome to episode 9 of You with Jesus. I just want to do a survey tonight of the 4 Gospels, 3 in particular, and I also want to talk about the geographical context in which the Gospels are being written. Well, as you know, there's 4 Gospels, and each are an account of Jesus' life. So the first 3, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, are known as the Synoptic Gospels. And synoptic basically means same-if. They follow the same basic chronology, and about 3/4 of the content is the same across all 3 synoptics. But when we come to John's Gospel, 92% of the material in John's Gospel is unique to John. Only 8% of John's content can be found in the other synoptics. Another key difference is that many of the stories in John's Gospel occur in Jerusalem, known regionally as Judea. In fact, in John's Gospel, Jesus visits Jerusalem regularly, and much of John's Gospel is drawn from Jesus' encounters in Jerusalem. So let's look closer at the 3 synoptics for a minute, and I want us to examine what scholars call the 4-source hypothesis to explain some of the content in the Gospels. Okay, so we have the 3 synoptic Gospels. Excuse my handwriting. It was never very good. It's about to get a whole lot worse. So 3 synoptic Gospels, and they are Mark, Matthew, and Luke. Now, 97% of what's in Mark can be found in either Matthew or in Luke. 97%. In fact, there's only 18 verses in Mark that are unique to Mark. Matthew is drawing on Mark, it would appear, and Luke is drawing on Mark. So we're going to call Mark a source. He's one of the sources. But then there's another source, because there's a bunch of material that is common to Matthew and to Luke that isn't found in Mark at all. So we're going to call this source Q. And we'll put a red ellipsis around it to identify it as a source as well. Q is the first letter of the German word Quell. And Quell in German means source, or the start of a spring or a fountain. So that's why we come up with this fancy letter Q. So there was a Q source, perhaps a person, perhaps some writings, perhaps a group of people. But both Matthew and Luke were in contact with Q, whatever that was, and they were drawing on that source to write a bunch of content. And you can find that same content in Matthew and in Luke, but you won't find it in Mark. Now, interestingly, both Matthew and Luke, even though they have that same content, draw different conclusions from that content or give a different emphasis to that content. And that goes back to the purpose that Matthew and Luke had for their Gospels. And we're going to come to that purpose in a moment. But there's another 2 sources at play here, and that is a source that Matthew was using and another source that Luke was using. And we'll put it in red to identify it as a source. And why do we know that? Well, because Matthew has got things in there that only Matthew has got, and Luke has got things in there that only Luke has got. So, Matthew and Luke draw heavily from Mark. Matthew and Luke draw heavily from another source we're calling Q. Matthew has got his own stuff and Luke has got his own stuff. And they think that Mark was probably the earliest gospel and that these other ones came later, and certainly John's gospel came even later still. Now, I mentioned that each of the synoptic gospel writers have a different purpose, and they also have a different audience. And they're also 3 different individuals from 3 different cultural backgrounds. And so you've got this different agenda, is that the right word? Running through each of the Gospels in order to achieve each one's objective. And I think that's what gives the accounts of Jesus a real authenticity, that we haven't got them all exactly the same. They're actually different, even though they're called the Synoptics, which means same-ish. They are different, and they're authentically different. They've got a real feel of historical authenticity. So Mark, he wants to speak of Jesus as like a great miracle worker. He is a man of action. Matthew, he's writing to a more Jewish audience, and his concern is to portray Jesus as a fulfiller of prophecy. And then Luke, his purpose, it would appear, is to convey Jesus as a perfect human. He's writing to a Greek cultured audience. Jesus is the perfect human who's compassionate and tells great stories because he's a real entertaining human who loves people and likes hanging out with all sorts of people who others wouldn't normally hang out with, tax collectors and sinners. So in Luke, Jesus is going for the worst. In Matthew, Jesus is fulfilling prophecy. And in Mark, Jesus is just doing stuff all the time. In fact, Mark's favorite word is immediately. So immediately this happens, then this happens, then this happens. And you just read Mark, it's all action-packed. Now, I want to talk for a few moments about the geography of where all this is taking place. What's the geographical context? And it's a lot more important than you might imagine it to be. When Kathy and I were younger, we did a course in Jerusalem called the Historical Geography of the Bible. It was a university course, and it was an absolute eye-opener for me in my mid-20s to be in Jerusalem, studying on Mount Zion, and doing field trips to all these different locations around Palestine, Israel, and the Negev Desert and Sea of Galilee and Dead Sea and everywhere else. And together with the readings, we did hours and hours and hours of map work so that we became really familiar with the topographical texture of the Promised Land and the land in which Jesus lived and ministered, doing those many field trips with a Bible in one hand and a map in the other. Now, prior to this, I hadn't considered the importance of geography when I had read the Bible. And since that first trip to Israel, I've been back a number of times. And now when I read the Bible, I can't help but see where these events took place. It reminds me that these events took place at real places in a particular time of history. And the geography of those places impacts the history. Geography impacts history because it impacts sociology and culture and politics in very profound ways. And this is not unique to biblical geography. Geography, the study of geography, will show that the geography of a land impacts the movement of people. It impacts strategies that are employed in war. It impacts the kind of climate that people face, the clothes they wear, the customs they have. It influences where towns and cities are built, where commerce takes place, and where the seat of power is. So when we read that Jesus went up to Jerusalem, we need to keep in mind that he actually did go up, and that going up involved going through certain places. So let's have a bird's eye lesson in biblical geography. There's basically 4 main vertical divisions, and let's look at each one in turn. The first one we can call the coastal plain, and that obviously runs up beside the coast of the Mediterranean and up to here. And then the second division is the hill country. So we have the hill country of Judea, the hill country of Samaria, and then the hill country of Galilee. Okay, so that's our hill country. Then alongside that is what we can call the Rift Valley, the Jordan Rift Valley. And in the middle of the Rift Valley, well, not exactly the middle, but here we have the Dead Sea, and up here we have the Sea of Galilee. And then on the other side of all of that, we have the hills of Jordan. You've got to remember that back in Roman times, a large part of what is now part of Jordan was part of the Roman Empire. In fact, this area around here was known as the area of the Decapolis. You may have come across that in your readings. And then just one last division to make, and this is a horizontal division, and it's this part here. This is the Jezreel Valley, okay? And it runs through there like that. But if you wanted to go from, say, the Sea of Galilee to Jerusalem, you got to about there, and you had to go up. You had to go up from about 400 metres below sea level to 900 metres above sea level. That's a 1,500 metre climb just there. So you could go this way, but it was kind of harder because you had hills all the time. You were going up and down all the time. You could go this way, but it was just a lot longer. So most people went this way and then they went up from there. I know my map's getting really messy. Sorry. So most of what is recorded in Matthew, Mark, and Luke happens in this area here, the area of Galilee and the hill country. And in John's Gospel, most of what we're reading there is happening here in Jerusalem. And there's a little bit recorded about what happens here in Samaria. So what about chronology? All three of the synoptics follow the same basic chronological timeline. They are biographies of Jesus' life, but not in the style of a biography that we might read today. It's difficult to map it all on a timeline with the associated geographical place name because they are not writing in that style that you and I think of when we think of biographies. So roughly speaking, if we were to take an overview of the chronology of Jesus, it starts in Cana in the Galilee region, and then it goes very quickly to Jerusalem, then back to Galilee, and then finally it ends up in Jerusalem. So, and that happens over a period of 3.5 years. And there's probably at least 3 times where Jesus and the disciples go to Jerusalem, and they go back to Galilee. So I hope this episode has helped you to understand the purpose of each Gospels, how the Gospels are similar, how the Gospels are different, and why they are different. And we've also looked at the geographical context in which all of this is taking place. And finally, we've looked at the rough chronology of the events that follow. This episode concludes what we can call Season 1. See you in the next episode.